Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Coffee HEMA with me, Jamie McKeever. Today I want to talk about kind of when it's appropriate to kind of go beyond the sources that you're working from. And some kind of considerations we've got to think about the sources in terms of understanding sort of what they really are and what the boundaries and what their strengths and weaknesses are, within the context of the historical context that they were in. So obviously HEMA historical sources are at its core, no matter how much or little you personally interact with sources or through your instructor. HEMA wouldn't exist if it wasn't for the existence of historical texts, writing down how to fence in some way, shape or form, right? That is at our foundations, at the heart of HEMA. And what that can lead to sometimes, though, is this kind of basically putting the sources up on a pedestal as if they are some kind of perfect, pure knowledge, insight into the true way of fencing, whatever that happens to be. By which I mean it's seen that the source is canonical, it's seen that the source, if it says it in the source, it must be true, whichever source you happen to pick. And there's a lot of problems with this view from a few different perspectives I want to unpick. First, the most obvious one is that, of course, the historical sources do not agree. They represent different systems, different ways of fencing, and while there is some overlap between many of them, there's also a lot of differences. A common one that I see a lot is pretty much every source you find that talks about where to look during fencing will give you a different answer. Some say look at the hand, some say look at the sword, look at the feet, look at the eyes, look some random place, and they can't all be right. Some of them have to be wrong. I guess a few of them could be right, and there could be multiple good places to look. But we have these discrepancies between sources, so they cannot be literally true principles of fencing that are immutable and perfect for all time. But even if you assume that they are broadly correct about fencing, the knowledge that the person writing the source has is imperfect. They have some presumably good ideas about fencing, although maybe some of them are crazy, and should be respected, should be used as somebody who is an expert and should be listened to, but not taken as the word of God, the word of fencing in that context. And even if you assume that their understanding of fencing is perfect, or at least so much beyond ours that we may as well treat it as such, there are lots of things implicit or explicit in the books that are less fencing related that we can obviously ignore. Vardy is full of some fairly fundamental classist ideas that obviously I'm going to ignore as irrelevant, and his claim that I will become rich from being a fencing master was clearly no longer true. But even kind of putting that aside, I think the more relevant one for the things that we might take to be kind of fundamentally correct is pedagogy, which I talk about a lot on this, right? In this series, that there is kind of an implied and implicit pedagogy in most books, and sometimes explicit pedagogy in most books. And we know from every kind of source looked at medieval pedagogy in any discipline, and Renaissance pedagogy in any discipline, that by and large, the ways that they taught were shit. And I'm not talking about swords specifically, but across the board, right? Rote learning was common. This kind of watching and doing, or being an apprentice for 20 years, where you start with the grunt work and you build up by copying the person, all this kind of stuff. The basic model of watch and copy as a style of pedagogy is not good anywhere for any discipline, but was the default for much of the medieval period. And is the implied pedagogy in lots of books that focus on plays, that focus on assault, this kind of stuff, of just kind of watch it, copy it. So already for this kind of core aspect that's sort of embedded there, we need to start looking beyond the book to sort of modern sports science, modern understandings of how to teach physical skills, And in these areas, while we might be assuming that the old masters have better knowledge of the sword arts that we're trying to teach and the principles of that, what we need to do is we need to extract those principles, as interpreters, we need to extract those principles and find more modern ways of teaching them. But then as well, the other thing I want to talk about, sort of going beyond the book, going beyond a book, is sort of thinking about working across multiple sources. And I think this is quite a crucial one, because what we need to understand is, again, even if we assume the knowledge about fencing of the sword master that we're studying goes beyond ours to a degree that we cannot challenge it, the book that they wrote is not a perfect representation of their knowledge, right? Necessarily, they've got to cut it some way. They can't put everything they know in one book. They may not explain it very well. The ability to describe fencing and the ability to do fencing are two different skills. And more importantly, whatever book we're working from was written for a specific goal, and that goal was not, generally speaking, somebody 600 years later picking it up with no instruction and learning defense from it. So as a result, these goals may directly clash with what we're trying to do. Vardy has loads of things. Vardy's book, the one I know the most, right, pretty much was written, as far as we can tell, to say to a young duke with a martial heritage, hey, look at me, I'm great, I can come teach you how to fence and be awesome like your dad, who's now dead. He's probably wasn't quite as blunt to the 12-year-old Guidobaldo, but maybe he was. Because there's lots of stuff in the manuscript where Vardy's basically saying, this thing here, this thing is the shit, but I can't write about that. I can only show you this in person, right? And it comes like 3-4 times. So his goal to get hired means that he necessarily is trying in his book to keep some things back, right? So, well, that doesn't help us, right? Maybe it helped him, although it doesn't look like he got hired, so maybe it didn't. Maybe Guidobaldo was as pissed off with him about this as I am. But this direct conflict between his goals in writing the book and my goals in working with it. Likewise, Marozzo is another kind of very alternative view of this one. I've been speaking to a friend of mine, Cosmos, about this quite a bit recently. And Marozzo has lots of assaults, lots of plays. There are lots of things that would be really good if you have a massive group and no safety equipment. And we know that the Bologna had a tradition of group classes going back to Dardi, right? So once again, there's a very specific sort of implicit goal in mind with Marozzo's book that is at odds with what I want to do, which is I want to learn how to fence well, myself, not necessarily by following through these kind of rote steps and all this kind of stuff, right? So this interaction means that that any one book is never going to get us the full story. And we need to look beyond a single book to start trying to think about, okay, what else can we pull it from? For my own part, well, you've got to be careful with this, right? Because you can't take every single book. Because as I said right at the start, they are describing different systems and they are often inconsistent. So this is something you've got to be, somewhat cautious with in terms of looking at, well, okay, how does this compare to that? And are they talking about the same thing or are they talking about different things? And for my own part, what I've done is I've stuck to books that are, or I started with rather, books that are close in time, close in language. So the sort of the Bolognese tradition, the Fiore, and seen where they can augment what Vardy is talking about and move beyond it, or explain things that he's clearly referenced but not referenced well. I use Vigiani's description of tempo to explain it because it's clearly talking about the same thing, but Vigiani explains it well and Vardy barely explains it. Dall'Agocchia's notion of tempo as well, actually, his 5 tempo went to strike. Again, you see this in Vardy, but Vardy doesn't explain it well. Dall'Agocchia explains it very well. These kind of notions of guard, notions of measure, all this kind of stuff, again, way more better explained in these other systems, provocations and things like that. And this allows us to sort of fill in the blanks with one source using other sources that maybe have been written for different purposes, and so can help us kind of shine a light on those areas that were deliberately obscured because of the purpose that the book was written to. If you go further afield, you can still kind of do these comparisons, but you've got to treat it with a bit more of a pinch of salt. It's much less, the further afield you go, the much less likely it is going to be that, you know, this can just naturally slot in because it's talking about the same thing, just describing it better. But even then, you can make comparisons, and in the comparison, you kind of start to understand aspects of the framework or the system that you're working to that are implicit in your system, but look like they're universal truths, even though they're not. You know, tempo is a good example, right, of this. You know, it's a core feature of Italian longsword, of Italian fencing in the early Renaissance, and just isn't present in a lot of the German sources. Some people are like, oh, it's really in-depth. It's not, right? They're different concepts. They explain similar things, similar moments in a fight, but not completely overlapping. Like, there's some overlap, there's some differences. And in the process of sort of looking at these and understanding them, we start to realize, like, what is a feature, you know, a fundamental feature of, you know, truth about fencing. I don't believe there are any. And what is just a core element of our system, and how do we then kind of understand the boundaries of the system and sort of what that does mean, what that doesn't mean, all that kind of stuff. So I would encourage anyone listening to this to read around. Don't just focus on a single source. Look for sources that are related to the source you work for to try and understand how you can plug the gaps. Those bits that are super confusing that you're looking at, and you're thinking, what the hell does this mean? Perhaps are explained very clearly in some other source. And also do look at modern sources, particularly for how to teach, because the historical fencing sources are pretty rubbish at that. Thanks for watching.